Welcome to Lyme Time. I'm Allie from the Tick Chicks. We are all more than Lyme disease and chronic illness, and together we stand with you to overcome and rise. I'll bring you closer to the experts in cutting-edge treatments and even a few unexpected ways of healing. I'll ask the questions you want answers to regarding Lyme disease and successful ways of getting you closer to 100%. We are in this together and will not be defined by Lyme. Today on Lyme Time, I am thrilled to welcome to the show Nicole Bell, and she is of Galaxy Labs, and she has quite a story to tell. I don't think it's like any other story that I've ever really heard because of all the nuances and the way her journey took her and the way that her education really laid the groundwork for where she is today and her experience with Lyme disease, not necessarily her own case of Lyme disease, although we'll get into that, but her spouse's. So let me tell you a little bit about Nicole. Nicole Bell is an author, entrepreneur, and advocate for tick-borne and neurodegenerative diseases. She advanced her professional career as an engineer and program manager and spent the last 15 years in medical devices and diagnostics. She became an executive in a fast-growing medical device company, building a world-class team in surgical robotics, driving the development of the surgical robot from breadboard design to FDA submission in 3 years. That's huge. And propelling the company's market cap to over $500 million. But when Nicole's husband became chronically ill, she took on her most challenging roles yet, caregiver and medical proxy. Her memoir, Lurks in the Woods, details the harrowing experience and seeks to help others navigate chronic conditions. She also served as the primary author of the State of Lyme Disease Research in the United States and regularly collaborates with the Center for Lyme Action to change the political landscape for Lyme disease and related co-infections, something that actually might be very timely right now. Originally from Boston, Massachusetts, Nicole earned a bachelor's and master's of science in materials science and engineering from MIT and a master's of science in biomedical engineering from Duke University. Nicole is currently the CEO of Galaxy Diagnostics, where she combines her professional experience with her passion to change the tick-borne disease landscape. Galaxy's mission is to create new diagnostic standard of care for tick-borne diseases and save millions of people from descending into chronic illness. Welcome to Lyme Time, Nicole.
Hey, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I've had the pleasure of actually meeting you in person about 6 months ago now. I think it maybe even a little bit longer. And you and I just connected right away. And I knew I wanted to have you on the Lyme Time podcast. But, it took us a little time to get here. And, since then, I feel like there have been so many changes. And we talk about politics and Lyme disease, and we'll get into that later. But there's just so much to your story, to all the layers of everything. I think I mistakenly called it Galaxy Labs, but it's Galaxy Diagnostics. So I know there's a huge difference there. So I want to correct that. But, before we get in too far, I just want to start with your own personal journey and sort of what led you up, what laid the groundwork into your relationship, how that started, the turns that it took, and kind of bring us all up to speed to kind of how that brought you to Galaxy.
Yeah, so let's see where to start. So
We can take it in sections if you want to.
Yeah, there's so much. So let's see. I'm originally from the Boston area, so that's kind of where I grew up, and so I've from there as you said, I kind of went to college in Boston, and pretty quickly out of college, I was recruited by my MIT professor to join his company, right? So I've been in startups pretty much my whole career. And that first startup was actually where I met my husband, Russ. So we worked together. He was not somebody I ever expected to fall in love with and get married to because he was about 20 years older than I was. But we were traveling a lot together. We became best of friends. And after about 2.5 years of working together, we started becoming a couple. And then we eventually got married and had kids. And so I've kind of continued my career in startups. The first half of my career was really more in the electronics industry, actually. And that was what Russ did as well. And then mid-career was when I went back to Duke and got into biomedical applications and engineering. And since then, I've worked in diagnostics. I've worked, as you said in my bio, in surgical robotics and all sorts of medical devices. And so the story is, I think, very similar for a lot of people, right? Like you're going along blissfully unaware of tick-borne disease. You may have heard of it. I grew up in Boston, right? So I'd heard of it. I remember when I was a kid, my mother was like, I went to Martha's Vineyard for the weekend with my cousin, and my mother was like, stay away out of the grass. Like there's so many ticks. Be careful of Lyme disease. And I'm like, whatever, mom, and how right she was.
Didn't slow us down, did it?
Yeah, you don't know when you're a kid. I fight the same battles with my kids now. And I and then it hit, my family. So my husband, he started presenting with more, neurological and mood-based disorders, right? So first, it was really more mood-based. So he would suffer from depression and anxiety, and he was more irritable than normal. He was noise sensitive, just things that at the time I thought were related to our situation, right? He had decided to retire from, he was a fast-paced executive as well, and he kind of decided to retire and be Mr. Mom and support me so that I could, do my thing. And I was like, well, maybe you ought to go back to work. You don't seem very happy. And but then he didn't, and we went to therapy, and it just wasn't really, it wasn't right. Like he was kind of different, and I questioned, like, well, hey, maybe it's our situation. Maybe he's not the person I thought he was. But then I started realizing he was having cognitive issues and he was forgetting things. Like, and he was a brilliant engineer, like probably one of the smartest people I've ever met. And
Wow.
all of a sudden, he couldn't remember the time to pick up the kids from daycare. He couldn't remember the time. Um, he was constantly, it felt like gaslighting at the time. He's like, you never told me that. And I'm like, yes, I did. What do you mean? I told you had to pick up the kids at 5 o'clock. And then he forgot. I think the moment when I really realized something was wrong was when he forgot the security, code for our house alarm system. And it just, something didn't feel right. And I started paying attention. And then I realized that he was having cognitive issues. And that kind of set us down our journey. And I'll pause for a breath if just, or I can keep going depending on what you
Yeah,
want.
no, I mean that's as you said, atypical in a way because it presented neurologically
Mhm.
in terms of just almost like mental health
Mhm.
conditions and forgetfulness and those kinds of symptoms are not what you automatically associate with typical Lyme disease, what might be at the top of everybody's head, which is pain, neuropathy and all sorts of issues that they can feel in their body so that
Mhm.
they can say to you, I don't feel right. I feel sick. I feel terrible. I'm going to go to bed, and it looks like that. But if it's infiltrating the brain, well, then they're not even maybe even quite aware of what's going on themselves. It really takes a spouse or a child or a partner to really articulate that. So then what was the next step? Did you go in for some test? Did he go in for some testing?
Yeah, so, very similar to what you just said, I had to convince him something was wrong, right? And so he didn't see it because it was him, and he also was irritable. So it was a little combative. Imagine telling somebody you think that they're having some sort of cognitive issues, right? It can be a little bit contentious. And so that was a challenge, but I was able to convince him to go to a doctor. I was like, hey, I think he knew inherently something was off, but he didn't quite know what to do. And so I was like, let's just go to the doctor. Let's get tested, right? And I had done some research, and Lyme disease actually came up. And he had lived all over the country in several areas considered endemic. He'd had multiple tick exposures that I knew of, and he had had many even before we met. And so that was one of the first things that I talked to the doctor about. It was in the first, went back to the first email that I wrote to the doctor, and we went to an integrative physician. So I didn't go to kind of traditional allopathic medicine. I knew that this was complicated just inherently because he seemed healthy on the outside, right? And so we went to the doctor. We had him tested for a full array of things, and including Lyme disease, and he tested negative. He only had one of the 5 bands on the Western blot, and everything else on his blood work and testing was considered quote unquote normal. And so, because most of his symptoms were neurologic, they referred us to, um, you know, uh, to a neurological, physician. Sorry, and he essentially, we went through a process where he went through a comprehensive diagnosis. And at the end of that, he got a few scans, first an MRI, then a PET scan. And his PET scan came back as having advanced stage Alzheimer's disease.
Wow.
Yeah. So I was still trying to convince him something was wrong. And the PET scan said that he had advanced stage Alzheimer's. And so we were floored, and he was devastated. I was devastated. And it just didn't make any sense, right? I'm like, oh, okay. He was older than I was, but still in his late 50s at the time. And he was extremely healthy. He ate a Mediterranean diet. He had no genetic predisposition to Alzheimer's. I had him tested with the most advanced panel, no comorbidities. And I'm an engineer. So I'm like, this doesn't fit, right? There should be a root cause for that's actually making my husband's brain systematically destroy itself. And we couldn't find any answers. And so we went from neurologist to neurologist, and they kind of looked at me like I was crazy for even asking the questions of what's causing his issues. They just said, well, it's Alzheimer's disease, and we're really sorry, and come back in 6 months and we'll track his decline. I mean, they were slightly more polite about it, but really that was all we had in front of us. And after raging against the machine and bouncing from doctor to doctor, I'd kind of given up because I hadn't made any progress. I didn't know what else to do. Russ was actually the one that convinced me, like, hey, if this is inevitable, then we should plan, right? We had 2 young children. We had to kind of figure out what we were going to do. And that was at the time when my brother called me, and his wife had been diagnosed with Lyme, Babesia, and Bartonella. And he's a doctor, and he started researching. And he said, Nicole, I think you need to have him retested. And we started talking about how bad the tests are and what the problems were. And we also, he encouraged me to get him retested. And that was when I figured out that not only did he have Lyme, but he also had Bartonella and probably Babesia. And so that is kind of the beginning of our tick-borne journey and really raising my awareness of the complexity of these diseases.
Now, I have a quick question. At the time, I know this was some years ago. What was the initial test where it showed up negative? What type of test was that?
It was a Western blot.
Okay, so, and now we know, fast forward, that it's not close to accurate, the Western blot, but it is what neurologists still depend on.
Correct.
Most neurologists that don't have further education in Lyme disease. In fact, my own neurologist was so resistant to doing a Lyme test. So that wasn't that long ago. And then what about the second time you tested? Did you use a different test for that?
So the second time we tested a bunch of different methods, and that was when like some of the tests were from LabCorp and Quest, and he was antibody-based positive. His repeat Western blot was also positive. We did do some specialty lab testing as well to confirm, and those kind of had variable sporadic results. But there was enough indication that we knew that we were on the right path.
That's right. And yeah, so once you have this diagnosis, and by the way, did your husband ever think it wasn't the root cause as well, or was he willing to accept it? How did he feel about his diagnosis?
I think he never understood the Alzheimer's diagnosis, but I think once the tick-borne, diagnosis came, he accepted it immediately because it made sense, right? He was an avid outdoorsman. He was always in the woods. He did all of our landscaping at the house. He had had multiple tick exposures. And even though he never had kind of the traditional bullseye rash and so forth, I think it just fit a lot more. And he was also excited that it was something that was treatable, right? So it's like, hey, there's Alzheimer's is basically just a death sentence. There's really nothing that they can do, and the treatments that are out there are sometimes effective for short periods of time.
Mm.
And the idea of, oh, hey, this is something that's a pathogen that might be able to be treated, and he could either stabilize or even recover was really compelling. But unfortunately, a lot of damage had been done at that point, right? This was 15 months after the point where he was given a diagnosis of late stage Alzheimer's disease, right? So we were behind the eight ball from the very beginning, unfortunately.
So where do you go from there once you have the diagnosis, and you all are obviously the brightest of the brightest people, and you've had the best education, and I'm assuming you have really, really good insurance because you were based also in the medical community. And what was your next plan of action?
I mean, so I started researching Lyme literate physicians in the area. We connected with one. He went on a broad spectrum antibiotic approach for a while and did that for several months with, some good encouraging results. But after about 6 months, he started to flatten out and then actually start declining. And so then we switched providers. I started networking around and I was digging into the research and trying to figure things out. We tried lots of different treatment modalities, antibiotics, herbals. We did stem cell therapies. We did, all sorts of different, IV. He had a PICC line in for several months. And I was just trying to do the best I could to take care of him. I mean, at that point, towards the end, he was a full-time dementia patient and he was somewhat an irritable one as well. And then I had two young children. I was still working. I mean, it was literally the hardest thing I've ever done. It pretty much, was at the verge of breaking me.
And how long? So you had said it had already been about 18 months since the initial diagnosis. So then, and then he was with us for how much longer after that?
So we treated for about 18 months after that. And that was when I made the difficult decision to basically place him in a resident care facility. I kind of realized that the treatment wasn't going to be effective. And I had two young kids that were really starting to suffer from living in that type of environment. And I couldn't be there for them. Obviously, their father couldn't be there for them. And so I placed him in a resident care facility in May of 2019, and then he ended up passing away in January of 2022. So, neurological tick-borne illness is pretty nasty. And, it's one of those things that can manifest in a lot of ways. I mean, not only did he have cognitive issues, but I now realize the Bartonella in particular leads to a lot of mental health issues. He was hallucinating. He thought people were living in our woods trying to kill us. That's part of the reason I named the book What Lurks in the Woods, in addition to the ticks, obviously. It was a really difficult period. And so it's like one of those things that you just can't believe unless you've seen it. And now, immersed in the research and the data and hearing all sorts of other patient stories because of what I do, I just realized how much misdiagnosis is out there and how, so many other people go for years getting this label of dementia, schizophrenia, rheumatoid arthritis, chronic fatigue, whatever it ends up being, right? There might be different answers out there, and you can actually get the proper treatment if you get to the right answer and you get the right diagnosis.
I'm sure you've seen a million scans and x-rays and things like that now. I'm wondering, what is the difference between Alzheimer's, advanced Alzheimer's, and Lyme disease when it shows up on a brain scan?
I don't know the answer to that. I know John Alcott has done some research and kind of brain scans and has seen very distinct patterns in, on different types of scanning techniques for PTLDS or post-treatment Lyme disease patients, chronic Lyme patients, whatever you would like to call it, versus normal brains. What I like to think about and the way that I see Alzheimer's disease is really just a symptom, right? It's an accumulation of plaque in your brain. And the question is why is your brain accumulating plaque? And actually, researchers at Harvard showed that the amyloid beta that often gets talked about in the plaque that gets talked about in conjunction with Alzheimer's disease is actually part of your innate immune response, right? So your immune system actually, that's one of the ways that it helps to fight off toxins and pathogens. And so the question is why is that happening, right? Is the amyloid beta the problem, or is it really a downstream reaction to something upstream that's truly the root cause? And so there's a lot of initiatives now looking at pathogens and the role of pathogens in Alzheimer's disease. I think toxins are another potential issue, mold toxicity or heavy metals, which Russ also had high levels of heavy metals. And so I think that that's something that's important to understand is Alzheimer's is they really don't know what causes it. And I think in a lot of cases, it can be a pathogen, and some of those pathogens are tick-borne. So really understanding what's going on and in diagnosing it, and then there's the potential to have reversible conditions, which has been demonstrated in the literature.
Yes, absolutely. We're learning a lot about that with the onslaught of MS diagnoses now.
Yes.
So when here you are, a now grieving mother,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm sure you're wading through all of the emotions of that, the devastation, the disbelief, the confusion afterwards. Like that really happened to me. And you and I had a very frank and real conversation because being a scientist, of course, and being an engineer and knowing all about what you know about, and then having a loved one pass from the effects of Lyme disease, you actually took an additional step that most of us, probably a lot of people, would dream about doing, and that is actually testing the brain tissue of your husband, your late husband.
Yes.
And it took you a long time. Will you tell us a little bit about that journey?
Yeah. So, like you said, I'm a scientist and I'm an engineer. And I think the whole time I was a caregiver for my husband, all I was trying to do was get answers. Right. And unfortunately, I couldn't get all the answers that I wanted. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was to do as much possible learning from his case as I could. I wanted to raise awareness. I wanted to learn, understand, and really truly figure out what happened to him. And so, a dear friend of mine that I've kind of met just through our joint experiences, Nikki Schultek, she runs the Alzheimer's Pathobiome Initiative. Actually, at the time, that didn't even exist, but she was starting to do all the things, and she was doing research through her other organization, Intracell Research. And so I called her and I said, I would like to donate Russ's brain to science. I wasn't aware, or I don't even know if Bay Area Lyme was actually accepting tissue donations, which they are now. So if other people have similar situations, I would say definitely contact Bay Area Lyme and their biobank. But Nikki helped me because she had researchers that she works with that are actually studying this particular issue. What's the role of Borrelia in Alzheimer's disease? What's the role of Bartonella? And also other pathogens like chlamydia pneumoniae and HSV and other viruses. And so she helped me get his brain donated to Dr. Brian Balin at PCOM, or the Philadelphia College of Osteopathic Medicine. And they have since studied his brain and found I now have images of Borrelia in Russ's brain. And so it's like, I'm not crazy. There's real science. And then actually Dr. Breischwert, who I worked with at Galaxy, also has samples of his brain tissue and is testing for other tick-borne pathogens, including Bartonella, Babesia, Ehrlichia, Anaplasma, all the usual suspects, in really trying to fully understand what we couldn't when he was alive. And so my hope is that that's a published case study someday. The fact that we can still see, I mean, I can't even tell you how many antibiotics that my husband was on. He was on a very broad spectrum protocol, including IV antibiotics. And the fact that there's still Borrelia in his brain is medically noteworthy. And so,
I was going to ask you, knowing he went on that aggressive of a routine and protocol, and then adding in the IV antibiotics and the PICC line and all that, he really did the antibiotics
yes.
the way that probably a lot of people would dream about doing, but he really went full throttle aggressive for, I'm sure, quite some time.
Yeah, it was at least 6 months. Yeah.
6 months, and that's a lot. And I was just wondering, did you ever do another scan? Did it make any difference? Did you see any reversal? Did he have any symptom? You said maybe it helped for a little while, but then it went worse. So would that be trackable?
Yeah, I mean, we never did have another follow-up scan, so I don't know. I think, a lot of his other symptoms went away. So initially, when we first started realizing something was wrong, he didn't have joint pain, right? But over time, he developed kind of migrating joint pain and other issues that were more customary or, quote unquote usual for Lyme disease, right? And I really know that there is no such thing as usual Lyme disease or tick-borne illness. And a lot of those symptoms did alleviate and get better. But the cognitive piece, I saw some glimmers here and there, but it really never improved. I think it's a lot of damage has been done, and for neurons to regenerate takes active work. We actually did some kind of advanced therapies that are meant to kind of regenerate neural tissue, but I think if you still have an active infection, it's really not going to be effective. And so it's difficult. I think all the research and all the science says the earlier diagnosis is better. And I think, once you have kind of the infiltration of the brain, it can be challenging. I'm not saying that it's not possible. I just, like I said, he was in late stage disease, and then it was, additional time before we even started antibiotics. And so we were really late to the game in terms of our treatment paradigm.
Was the next step that you took writing the book, What Lurks in the Woods? And was that just therapeutic for you? Tell us about the book and what kind of genre it is. I'm sure I will have it at thetickchicks.com as we air this episode. But tell us a little bit about the book and how that came to be.
Well, I mean, you nailed it when you said, here I am grieving, confused, trying to put together all the pieces of my life. And I'm a project manager, engineer. I like things to be in their tidy little places. And essentially, I had just been living in chaos. I mean, not only did I lose my husband, but he was in active dementia. And it was like all the pieces seemed like they were broken and shattered all around. So I stepped away from my job and I said, I'm going to just focus on the family and take some time to heal. And I was fortunate enough that I had the opportunity to do that because I know a lot of caregivers can't. And so I had journaled. Part of the way that I had coped with the massive amount of stress and challenges that I had as a caregiver was I started journaling, right? And that was really helpful for me because I'm a ruminator. And when I like to solve problems at work, right, things just loop in my brain until I kind of figure them out. But I had things that were looping in my brain and I couldn't figure them out. And so I needed to have an outlet to get them out and to just kind of feel better. And so I found that journaling and writing really helped me. It didn't solve the problem, but it gave me an avenue to release it. And so I had the idea early in my journey. I was like, I'm going to take this someday and turn it into a book. And at the time I thought, hey, this is going to be a book about how my husband got diagnosed and got better, right? Unfortunately, it didn't end that way. But I realized that made it even more important to share our story, right? Because the gravity of our situation, that's how big it is, right? It's a life and death situation if you get the wrong diagnosis. And so I wanted to go through that. I took the time, and I ended up being during COVID. So I was home with my kids, navigating homeschool and all the things. But it was a hugely therapeutic exercise for me. I mean, I've always written in kind of a technical context for my job and been a good communicator, but writing something like this and using it as a vehicle to heal was frankly one of the reasons I can talk about it so openly, is because it was really a way to process and to deal and to share. I remember I was in a mastermind group with my book, with a book group, and I would have to write what I was going to do. I would have to read it. I'd be bawling. Then I would have to sleep on it, right? Because your brain, assimilates things when you're sleeping. And then the next day I would be able to read it to the group and not completely break down. And doing that process and sharing the story was hugely helpful. So, because it was quite a mess.
Uh,
So,
and so now the next stage of your journey is actually putting yourself to work and
yes.
devoting now your life to this mission of Lyme disease.
Yep.
You've experienced it. I don't care if you have Lyme disease or not. You experienced it firsthand. Right
Yeah.
there, you saw the the fast decline. You saw the misdiagnoses. You saw it all happening real time. So what led you to think to yourself, now I really want to make a difference in terms of research and all the things that you're doing? Talk us through that.
Yeah. So I think, after I wrote the book and I was like, okay, I'm going to become an advocate, right? I want to share this story. I want more people to be aware that Lyme is not just a bullseye rash and a fever, right? And that complex cases and complex chronic illness can be caused by these pathogens. And so I started doing that. And then actually, through serendipity, I got introduced to Bonnie Crater at the Center for Lyme Action. And she read my book and she asked me to take on the project, which became the summary of the state of Lyme disease research. And this was a project that they really wanted to do to advocate for more NIH funding, right? NIH does not have the level of funding that's needed to solve this problem, and it's completely unbalanced with other infectious diseases, including other way more rare vector-borne diseases like malaria and so forth. And so um, she wanted to have a document that summarized all of the fantastic research, most of it from private funding because NIH funding is not sufficient, and from Bay Area Lyme, the Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Foundation, the Global Lyme Alliance, and show them that Lyme disease is, a very misunderstood disease that leads to a lot of complex chronic conditions. And so we did that. And the reason I took it on, because when she first asked me, I was like, holy moly, that's a ridiculously complex problem. Like, I'm not sure I can do it.
Big ask. And
It's a big ask,
what year
but I
was
was,
that
what
about?
was that?
What year was that?
Oh, geez, that would have been 2022, 23. Oh, sorry, it's all a blur these days. Maybe 2023.
Yeah.
Um, Probably 2022, 23 timeframe. And so, yeah, but I was standing on the backs of the tick-borne disease working group and other folks that had done a lot of the work, and she connected me with a lot of great advisors that could help me through it. And we did it. And the reason I said yes was because that was what I wanted when I was a caregiver, right? I was so confused trying to dig into the research, and I was reading the CDC pages saying chronic Lyme didn't exist, and, just all the things that I was completely confused and didn't make any sense. And I wanted to provide a tool for patients, for doctors, for other, for anybody who was interested to learn and to see the research that was out there. I mean, the work of John Alcott, Monica Embers, all the folks, Dr. Breichwart. I mean, there's just so much work that has been done that needed to be highlighted. And so that's what it started. And I started digging in, and at some point I realized, hey, being an advocate is fantastic and I'm going to do it for my entire life, but I'm an engineer and I'm an entrepreneur and I like to solve problems and provide commercial solutions that will fix things. And to me, diagnostics seemed like the best place to slot in, right? Because I had worked in diagnostics before, so I understood it. And because if you don't, treatment's a huge problem too, right? But diagnosis to me is the first step, because you can't get a good treatment if you don't have an accurate diagnosis. And actually, Dr. Breichwart, who is one of the founders of Galaxy, that's one of the things he says is the kindest form of treatment is an accurate diagnosis. And so if you don't know which pathogen you have, then how are you going to get better? And so I took the research that started with CLA and I started digging a little bit deeper and I researched all the specialty labs and the standard of care and things going on in university settings. And ironically, Galaxy stood out to me as the one that really was solving the right problem, right? Which is direct detection. So a lot of people get confused. They say, well, Lyme disease, they've heard things like Lyme disease testing is about as accurate as a coin flip, right? It's 40 to 60% accurate. And so why is that, right? The reason is that these are pathogens that are hugely elusive. They hide from the immune system. They're not free circulating in biological samples like blood. And they they exist in very low levels. So they're below the limits of detection of conventional methods, right? So the way that we do diagnosis is through antibody-based testing, which relies upon the host or the human to develop an immune response. But what we know is those immune responses are delayed. So you miss the window when treatment's most effective, which is basically as soon as you get symptoms. And also, lots of people have mixed immune responses. Some people don't establish immune responses at all for reasons that are not 100% clear. Some people who've been sick for a long time, like my husband Russ, actually have suppressed immune systems, right? And then actually we even medicate people and suppress their immune systems on purpose. And so they don't have enough antibodies. And so what Galaxy was doing was trying to solve the direct detection problem, right? How do we show direct evidence of the pathogen in your body? And that means solving that limit of detection problem, right? So figuring out, one, what's the right sample to test. And for Lyme disease, it's not blood, because Lyme doesn't like to be in the blood. But they had actually partnered with George Mason University that was looking for protein markers secreted by the pathogen that actually go and get secreted through your urine. And that actually has been shown to be hugely accurate for both acute and chronic stage disease.
Wow.
And so, different approach, but very effective. And then for a lot of the co-infections, they were using proprietary techniques to enhance and enrich the pathogen, and then using advanced PCR methods, right? Everybody kind of got a crash course in diagnostics through COVID, right? Traditional PCR isn't sensitive enough, but there's newer methods of PCR that are kind of being emerging in other spaces that Dr. Breichwart and other people had used at NC State to get better detectability. And so we're actively using that for diagnosis of a lot of the top co-infections, and that can be done with a blood-based panel. So anyways, that's a lot of sciencey words and things, but I was drawn to the technology, to the company and to the technology. And and it just was serendipitous that it was where I lived, right? Right. And out of NC State originally, and right in North Carolina, which is my home state for several years now. And so I just kind of introduced myself to the founders and got to know them. And then when I realized that the science was real and that there was an opportunity to really change the standard of care, not just be a cool specialty lab and provide answers to people who can cash pay, right? But to really solve the problem and change the standard of care and provide better solutions. That was when I decided to join the company. And in June of last year, I took over as CEO, and we're really looking to scale to get FDA approval to really tackle the problems that it takes to change the landscape.
I mean, if that ain't a story, I don't know what is. You really, just full circle. And I just feel like he's energetically all around you, and he's just as passionate about this as you are. And it brings tears to my eyes, because it's like, there are no coincidences. You happen to be in that part of the country. It's all at your fingertips. It's just easy. When something comes into your space, the second you put it out, you know that it's just, you're meant to do this. And I can't even really describe it any other way. Um, so I mean, going from what you knew and what you were passionate about when you first got married, and then seeing this transpire, and then ending up as the CEO of Galaxy. So how would the normal physician be introduced to Galaxy, and can anybody, explain to me the relationship between the doctors and the actual diagnostic tests. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so doctors can basically just set up an account online. So we don't do direct to consumer. So patients will need to go to a doctor to get an order for testing, but it's really easy for a doctor to set up an account. And I encourage patients, to if you can't go to a Lyme literate doctor and you're trying to convince your current doctor to allow you to get tested, I think that state of Lyme disease research from CLA is a great thing. Actually, iLads is using it as a vehicle to help educate and do physician education. And so that's a great thing you can print out. You can, make a QR code and kind of send it to them and have them take a look. And hopefully if they're the right kind of doctor, they'll pay attention. But yeah, doctors can order. We have several different types of tests. So we have our Lyme urine antigen test, which is great, not only for early diagnosis, but also for, there's so many people that have been diagnosed with Lyme and then they get treated and then they still feel terrible. And right. And the question is why are you still feeling terrible? Are you still terrible because the pathogen is still in your body? Like obviously it was for my husband because it was in his brain, or are you still feeling sick because you have an undiagnosed co-infection, right? Or are you sick because you've developed some autoimmunity or your gut's out of whack from all the antibiotics or other, issues? There's lots of different issues. And so the way that a lot of doctors are using our tests is to try and figure out, do you have evidence of the infection still being there, right? Like if the proteins that we're searching for are still there, then that's evidence that you might still have active Borrelia going on. And so it's great for kind of that discernment of where you might be in your treatment paradigm. And then we also have a blood-based co-infection. So just last month, we launched our blood-based test for Borrelia, Bartonella, and Babesia, which is really the best in class direct detection methodology for all three of the pathogens. And you may ask me, okay, well, why are you testing Borrelia? You've just said multiple times in this podcast that Borrelia is not in the blood. And the reason is Lyme Borrelia is not in the blood, but relapsing fever Borrelia actually is and replicates in higher copy numbers so that you can detect it with our techniques. And so generally, it's a genus level test, meaning it'll catch all Borrelias, but generally just because of math, right, and the abundance of these pathogens, if you do get a positive, it's going to be a relapsing fever Borrelia. But then we also test for Babesia and Bartonella at the genus level, so all strains of Babesia, because that's, I think, one of the things leading to misdiagnosis is if you do antibody-based testing, often they're just looking for one strain, but there's over 100 strains of Babesia. And we're learning every day that a lot more of them impact and affect humans than we previously thought. And there's over 50 strains of Bartonella. And again, many of them are known to infect humans and other mammals. And so with the testing that we provide, we're screening for all of them. And so it's a good way to see what your co-infection status is. And over time, we'll add additional pathogens and, help people figure out what's going on.
I think it's so important to just stress this to anybody listening. Even now, to 2025, I had to gently explain to my really, really smart doctor because I wanted to try SOT treatment. And she was agreeing with me. She was like, "Oh, that might be very good." I mean, even though I don't have any symptoms and I'm really in remission and have been for many years. But, it's still there lingering in my blood test. I don't know what to really do with that information. And a lot of people say, no, I eradicated it totally. And then I have other doctors actually tell me it will sometimes never be eradicated totally. So I don't know where the science is on that. But, here you are, you're about to spend, I don't know, $2,500 for one treatment, maybe even up to $300 by the time you're getting all your blood work done and everything for a treatment. And the doctor's saying, okay, well, let's treat, because I initially treated for EBV, but then I was going to treat for Lyme just to I don't know, sweep up a few crumbs that might have been along my way. But they didn't do the correct. They just knew I had Borrelia. They didn't really know what else was going on. They didn't know what I think there are different strains of even Borrelia.
Yes.
So if you're not super specific with what kind of treatment you're getting, you're not going to get anywhere. And I hear a lot of people say, oh, that didn't work for me. And I think how many people are out there with doctors that are just saying, and this is a quote from my doctor. She goes, well, we just do the one that most people have.
Yeah.
Well, that's not good enough. And that's
Yeah.
so substandard. And this isn't a great integrative medicine doctor. So there's a lot of, I'm just so thrilled that you have such a specific urine test and now blood test to really get in there and get some specifics because I think it makes a difference in how you go about treating it. You might treat Borrelia very differently than you're going to treat babesiosis. I mean, that's a parasite.
Yes.
So you're going to treat differently. And I just don't think that the average person that gets a Lyme diagnosis has any idea what that means
Yeah.
and how specific they really have to be in order to really accurately treat it. So I
No,
thank you so much
it's
for that.
no, it's absolutely true. And I think, the first line of defense for Lyme disease is doxycycline, right? And evidence has shown that that on its own doesn't always eradicate the bacteria. But as Dr. Breischwart would say, you can you can put a patient in a sea of doxycycline, it's not going to get rid of the Bartonella, right? And then to your point, Babesia is a parasitic infection. And so that's a completely different treatment protocol, which is actually more like a malaria treatment protocol. And so it's really important to understand what's on board. And someday, maybe, you may even want to know what species of Babesia you have. For example, in the veterinary world, they treat large Babesias differently from small Babesias and the different strains. Now, we're probably a long way away from that in human medicine, but you know, the more information you know about what pathogens you have, the more likely you are to get a better treatment. And so that's why I think the diagnostics is the key, and that's why I'm so passionate about this space to provide better answers to patients.
Oh, and it's changing every day. And I just want to stress to everybody out there, wherever you donate your dollar, just know that it really is there are really teams and teams of people working behind the scenes, just like Nicole, that are dedicating their life's mission to this. They may not have even experienced Lyme disease themselves, but they're passionate about figuring out this puzzle. And until we really start making strides for figuring out the puzzle, it's just going to remain kind of this glob of murkiness, quite frankly, for the average patient. A lot of the patients they get very anxious and they get impatient about why don't I have the right test and why don't I have, why aren't we further along in this? Well, it's as Nicole said, a very, very complicated disease and very multi-leveled and can morph and change. I'm wondering if your husband at the initial test, I wonder if he actually, if his antibodies just weren't showing. I wonder if it just hadn't settled in enough, or did he just not have a specific enough test?
I think that, when you're chronically ill, so I believe that Russ probably had some of these pathogens on board for a decade or so, right? The reality is that you can become infected. You might get a mild fever that you chalk off to like a flu or something, or you might not get a fever at all. And your immune system can keep the pathogen at bay, right? I like to think of the immune system as it's like a bucket, right? You can keep a lot of stuff in the bucket, but then over time you may have other assaults that happen and all of a sudden the bucket starts to flow over, right? Or it's a tipping point, whatever analogy that you want to use. And so I think he had these pathogens on board. And when I looked back as part of writing the book, it's like, he had a panic attack 5 or 6 years before he started really getting quote unquote sick, right? And so that was likely a symptom that we overlooked, right? He was irritable, a symptom that we overlooked. He had little pock marks on his leg that, he thought were chigger bites. And now I realized are actually kind of classic dermatologic manifestations of Bartonella. When he was in the shower, he had striae, that looked like stretch marks. I didn't even know what those were.
Right.
I thought he was scratching himself and the hot water was causing these reactions. And so I think think the number one, I say the number one issue is diagnosis, but the first thing is actually really awareness of the fact that these diseases are way more complicated than people understand, and that they can be on board and you can develop symptoms later. And you have to be aware that, neuropsychiatric symptoms might be a sign of tick-borne illness. Rheumatologic symptoms might be a sign of tick-borne illness. Cardiac symptoms might be a sign of tick-borne illness. And so, it's difficult because most people don't have the medical training. They don't consider themselves an expert in medicine, but you are an expert in you and how your body is reacting and behaving. And so if something's wrong, then you should start digging and trying to figure out what's causing the issue.
Absolutely. And I think generalizing here, but women are very intuitive beings and they're very mothering, and they may have that initial hit, especially with men, because the typical autoimmune patient tends to be a female. Why? I don't know. We handle our stress in different ways, and we have hormones that are different, and all of the above. But for men, talking about a rash or just even a mild symptom that a spouse or partner may pay attention to, the men are just going to keep on keeping on, and it's they deal with it in a different way. So I think you're right, just bringing the awareness to it, and gosh, just being as supportive as possible. And I hope that, with all of these tests, my own journey involved both a blood and a urine test, and that was way in the beginning where I had to go to like an experimental doctor basically. And that's what he decided to do with me. It was not mainstream at all. Anyway, but so much information. I want to thank you. This is it's probably, even though it's making a difference in so many people's lives, it's probably, hard to go to these vulnerable places and relive it on some level, and really understand, how incredibly difficult it was on your family. And so I just want to say thank you for being so transparent. And I know that you're going to be helping so many out there that take the time to listen to this, who may even be going through it themselves right now with a loved one, or even maybe with themselves. Maybe they think, gosh, that's not like me to forget this, or I'm a little scared that this is kind of going, this way. To get in there and get some accurate testing done. Can you just tell us where, we can hear about you, and also please give our listeners a final word if they are going through something like this in terms of mental health, or their spouse might be, or somebody that they love, even a teenager, whatever.
Yeah. So you can find more about Galaxy on our website. So galaxydx.com. And in there's information for providers, patients, about our testing information. And I would encourage people to take a look. And if they have any issues, they can reach out to the contact email on there. You can also learn more about my book and me at NicoleDanielleBell.com. And the book is on Amazon. And I think for folks that are interested in kind of getting other people to understand the journey, right? Like sometimes I tell people who've been through it, maybe you don't want to read it because it might be a little triggering, because my story doesn't end well. It's not the happy, everybody got healthy at the end of the day kind of story. But it's really good to share with your friends and loved ones so that they kind of understand what you're going through, right? And they can have a little bit of empathy for the confusion and the challenge that you get with this disease state. And I think for parting words, for people going through it, or in the midst of caregiving, is really just to give yourself some grace, right? I'm a type A type person, and I was trying to do all the things, and you always think that you should be doing better, and you chastise yourself for not being able to do it all. And it's impossible to do it all, right? It's really difficult. I mean, I was trying to do my job, my husband's job, and then adding on a third job of being a caregiver, as his health declined. And it's just for anybody to expect that they could do that is unrealistic. And I realize that now in hindsight, but at the time I beat myself up. It was difficult. I shut friends out. I didn't ask for help. All the things that would have been the journey is never going to be easy, but it would have made the journey easier if I had really reached out to my support network and folks that I know love us and want to help us and take care of us. And so I would say for anyone living through the journey, just try and figure out how to use your network and be as open as you can, because not only will it help you, but it'll help raise awareness for other people in the future who might end up experiencing the same thing someday, because these are universally present pathogens. And I think the more people that know about them, the less likely people are to suffer from some of these complex conditions.
Oh, that's so well said. Uh, Amen. And I'm wondering about the future of testing. I'm wondering what direction it's going. I know that from my listeners and my followers, I'm getting constant questions about the mother to child transmission of Lyme disease. And is it possible? And what is the latest research showing? If you don't have the answers, that's okay. But I'm wondering if there are some tests in development for that kind of thing. Even I don't know about in utero, but like what's on the future for Galaxy?
Yeah, I mean, in utero, I don't know of any tests that you could do. That would be something to discuss with your GYN. I mean, some we could on a research basis eventually have some things, but for the current status, if you're pregnant or thinking about getting pregnant, I think direct detection is a great option, right? Because it tells you, is the pathogen active in your bloodstream? If you have an antibody, that says you've been exposed, but it doesn't necessarily say you have active infection going on. And so it may or may not be a risk factor. And so I think, me personally, if I was going to get pregnant, I would do the Lyme urine antigen test. I would do a direct RBBB test, which does the top 3 pathogens, and just see what you have, and then work through it with your doctor as to what's the safest way for you to have, a safe pregnancy. There's in the state of Lyme disease research, we did talk a little bit about some of the data that's in there, because I think there is evidence of transmission of Borrelia that's been shown in the literature, and more studies need to be done. And I think that it's something people should consider and be aware of.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time, Nicole. I really appreciate it. I feel so touched by the way that your life has gone. I mean, I'm sure it's a direction that you never ever even imagined, but we are so lucky to have you on the forefront of all of this research and diagnostics for everybody out there, for literally millions of people out there. So we are just so grateful that you gave your time today, and I hope to have you back again soon.
Oh, I would love to. Thank you so much for having me. It's really been great.
Thanks again. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lyme Time Podcast. If you like what you heard, please subscribe on your favorite platform to be notified of new episodes. Remember, this is not intended to be medical advice. Take your findings to your provider to see if something is right for you. No two bodies heal the same, and your doctor knows you and your labs best. You can find out more about the Tick Chicks at thetickchicks.com, and if you subscribe there, you'll be notified of upcoming events like the in-person Losing Lyme retreat that I host. I also have shopping pages dedicated to helping your at-home symptom relief, as well as a private support group. Join the Tick Chicks tribe on Instagram, YouTube, Meta, TikTok, Pinterest, and X. You are not alone.